Hi everyone, it's George Bellville here with the Head for Home team of the KW Collective, and I'm making this video because I wanted to go into more detail from our prior overview video of helping someone sell a home and go into a little bit more detail about things you can think about in advance and to consider when you're helping a parent or someone else in your family who needs to sell their home. Usually it's a parent, or it could be an aunt or an uncle, but I wanted to talk a little bit more in detail about that and some of the things you can do in advance to make this a much better process. As you know, this can be a very complicated, strife-ridden situation depending on the circumstances. Sometimes people retire, sell their dream or their home and move into their dream retirement home, and it's a very happy situation. Other times you have a sudden onset medical calamity and it's not what anybody wanted. Regardless of the circumstances, they all go better if you have a plan in place. You've spoken to people who will be involved with that situation in advance, and everybody has a pretty good idea of what their role will be and what the scenario may look like. And I'd like to talk about that in a little more detail. So one thing I want to mention at the very outset is it usually ends up in this situation with children helping their parents sell a home, and whether or not there is a plan, that we'll table that for now. But one thing I want to suggest is you as an adult could do a lot of the planning yourself so that your children are told what you want rather than later on down the road them having to come to you and ask what you want and it's never been discussed before. So we tend to think of it as the children have to step in, take over the scenario, especially if there's dementia or something that limits someone's faculties. And it doesn't have to be that way. This can all be planned for in advance by the person, by themselves, or as a family, as a group, so that it's all a cohesive structure. So I want you to think about that. Like, what could you do? How could you prepare for this situation? Because most people understand the need for a will. A lot of people don't have a will. Living wills, medical power of attorneys, things like that. People understand that. That's part of the process, but the home sale process is kind of layered on top of that, and it can be very, very complicated and fraught with emotion and competition between siblings and all kinds of things. So I would love for everybody to think about it for themselves and what they can do to make that a better situation. And also I want to talk about how, as an adult child of someone who might need to sell their house, how you can broach this topic and develop a plan. As you all know, our PATH program is what we call it: plan, assess, take action, and head for home. And sometimes developing a plan is harder than it sounds because you have to bring up a very touchy topic. Someone may not want to give up their autonomy. They may not want to think about down the road. They may have all kinds of fears about finances and things like that. So it can be a bit of a minefield to get the conversation started, but once you do, it can be very rewarding, and it can be a great way to facilitate this process being much better down the road. So first of all, you may want to consider what topics or situations or timely things are there in your life that could happen that might be a nice segue into this conversation with a parent. I know some people talk about finances and wills and all that among the family openly, and everybody knows the financial situation. A lot of families don't. So you can think about, I wouldn't do it at a birthday, but there are times during the year when you might want to have this conversation. Even better if you do some planning, if you have a will done, that's a great opportunity to have a conversation with your family, and perhaps you could tell them, like, hey, I had my will done. I want to give you a copy of it just in case something happens. And during that process, you could say, hey, by the way, or you could do it as part of, let's say you had your annual physical and you just happen to bring it up in conversation and then try to lead that into a conversation about them and their future. Like I said, some people are very sensitive to it because ultimately what this all ends up leading to is the person you're speaking to at some point is going to lose their freedom and their autonomy. And nobody wants to give up their autonomy. And that's really what you're talking about, even though it's way down the road. So there are some questions that you can ask, and I have specific ways that I like to phrase questions with people that don't use any force. Forceful questions are not appropriate in this situation. So I want to share those questions with you and explain to you why they might be a good choice for you. Okay, the first question is, what situations would make you move out of this house or condo or whatever? So first of all, I wouldn't say home. That just loads some emotion and feeling into it. But what situations would make you or cause you to move out of this house? So that's implying external forces, not a choice, but you're broaching the subject of what could happen to make you do it. You're not asking for specifics. You're not saying when. You're not saying why. You're saying what circumstances could cause that. And there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. It's not a yes or no. The last thing you want to do with, it's like with a child, you say, do you want the green toy or the red toy? Well, they might not want either one of those, but you're forcing them into a choice. Nobody wants to be forced into that choice. So that's a way of opening up the conversation about what could happen. And it's external to them, it's external to you, and it's not quite such a personal way to ask the question. And it's a great way to facilitate them thinking about it and hopefully giving you an answer. The second question is, when the time comes, or when that time comes, how would you like the process to go? And I like that question because you're making it a process. You're not making it, they're not folding, they're not caving, they're not giving up, they're not too old. It's just you're talking about the process, not necessarily the deeper, more emotional parts of it. And the good thing about that question, it's open-ended. It doesn't say, when you can't go up and down the steps anymore, you're going to have to do something else. Like that's not what people want to hear. So that gives you a good way to get their mind thinking about the process, and the answer will give you some information that you can use to figure out how do you get to the next steps or what they may really want. And the last one, and this is a pretty broad question, but that question is, where do you think you will go? And when you ask that question, like I said, it's open-ended. You could get all types of answers, and obviously it does depend. If there's a medical situation, they'll have to address that. If they have mobility issues, that can determine where they live. But it's a nice open-ended conversation or question to start the conversation. And you may find that there's a range of different answers. One of the ones I hear all the time, I speak to people who maybe do or do not want to sell their house. They're still resisting it. But the answer I always get is, they'll carry me out of here in a pine box. And while that's not necessarily usually what they mean, it means they just don't want to talk about it and they don't want to consider any of the other options. But asking these questions gives them a chance for them to tell you without where they stand, without it being resistant to you. You can ask these questions so many wrong ways that are forceful, and it puts them in a position of having to respond to you and what you want. Whereas when you ask open-ended questions, they give a chance to fill in their thoughts. For example, for me, my children will know that if ever the time comes, I don't want to pass away in my residence. I'd rather pass away in a facility or somewhere like that. I don't want the energy of that's happened. I don't want that memory associated with that place. I don't want to be the place where I passed, just in case somebody ends up keeping the house or whatever the case may be. I'm perfectly fine being in some type of sterile medical setting for that. I don't care. Other people have very strong opinions about their home and how things should go. And I really feel like asking these questions can open up some great communication with you and your loved ones about how you want these things to go. So as I said, we have a P in our program. P is for plan, and it's great to have a plan, or at least think you have a plan, because as you know, things can change. But one of the ways you can get a plan, obviously the prior questions that we talked about might generate some conversations that could lead to a plan. Another thing you can do, and make it not quite such a global conversation, is make it a capacity question or conversation. For example, my mother-in-law had to sell her house because it had too many steps. She had a knee replacement, and her house had, I think, 5 levels. Just was untenable. So one thing you can do, and you can do it well in advance, you can say, when you're no longer able to X, what do you want to do, and where would you like to go? And that can get them to think about it. I have a good friend who worked for a company that helped facilitate transitions for seniors. It's very well known. I'm not going to say their name, but people call them to get help with where their loved one could go when they're in the middle of it. They need a rehab facility or whatever the case may be. And I asked her one time, because I talk with people in these they're gonna sell the family home and retire, downsize, beach house, whatever they're doing. And I asked her, what's the one question that I can ask people to give them the best possible advice from my perspective? And she said, how much longer are you going to drive? Are they going to be able to drive? And I think that's a great question, because I talk to a lot of people who, they don't like the idea of senior care, assisted living, all those things. They might want to try an over 55 community or condominium or something like that. And the question I have is, how much longer are you going to be able to drive? Because most of those places, if it's just an over 55 community, they don't have any resources for people who can't drive. For example, I live in Howard County. In Howard County, most of the places you can live, it's a desert island if you don't have a driver's license. So they're building a new over 55 community that's really nice in Ellicott City. If you can't drive from there, there's no public transportation. You can Uber, but that would be very, very expensive. So that's a great question to ask somebody, to say, when that time comes, where do you want to go? Or anything else. And if they're in the situation where they're starting to have some medical issues, then you can say, like, when you get to this point, what would you like to do? And that way, as I said, if it's a global question, people tend to resist that. But if you can be more specific, it's very helpful to them to help them decide. Another part of this that I'd like to discuss as part of the plan, and plan and assess. And as I've said before, that's kind of a loop, because you can have a plan. Once you assess, your plan may change a little bit. But another part of this that I strongly recommend is, if there are siblings, among the siblings, you need to have a conversation about this and try to come to terms about what you're going to do. Because I cannot tell you how many times I have dealt with someone selling their house or an estate sale or something like that, where there are siblings who are not getting along, they're fighting, one's taking over, one's doing nothing, all these things, all the sibling rivalries from eons bubble up, and it makes the situation way worse than it has to be. So if you talk about it in advance, there are 2 advantages to that. A, you have clarity on, that you're all kind of in this together. But the second is, you can, I shouldn't say assign roles. You can come up with what the roles are going to be in advance. So when the time comes, there are no surprises and everybody knows what their expectations are. Because it always seems to me like there's one who's doing the most of the work, especially if there's an odd number. If there's 3, there's one who really doesn't want to do anything, and then the other person's kind of in the middle. And there's also geography. So if you live close to your parent, and you know that in the next whatever years they're going to need to sell, or they might pass, there may be a sibling who lives far away in another state. You can give them roles. You can say, look, I know you're not going to be able to be here for a lot of this. Here are some things that you could do, or what could you do to help with this process? Record keeping, phone calls. The person who's driving them to the doctor's appointment doesn't have to be the person who makes the appointments, does the follow-up, checks with the other specialists. And if you have those conversations in advance, it's a lot better. Because if a parent is ill or in the hospital or has passed, I mean, that's an extremely emotional situation. You can't expect people to be on their best in that situation. However, if they've planned for it and they know it's coming and they know what their role is going to be, it's a lot easier to facilitate everything and get the communication to where it should be, so that all doesn't bubble up, as I said, and create a very uncomfortable and difficult scenario. In fact, I've worked in scenarios where one of the siblings is intentionally sabotaging the entire process to stop it, just to make everyone mad and hurt everyone's feelings. And if that's going to be part of the equation, boy, it would be a lot better to know that 10 years in advance when you've kind of had this pre-planning meeting. That's for sure. So when we assess things, we use money, motivation, must have, may have, where, and when. Those are the categories that we always look at things through that lens. So, and money in this case, money and legal really are kind of one thing in this type of scenario. So everybody, there are people all over the spectrum in terms of their finances. Most people are in the middle of the bell curve, and for most people, the sale of a parent's house is going to be a sizable portion of their portfolio or nest egg and what they have to either pay medical bills or whatever the case may be. So it's really important to talk about those things and figure out the dollars and cents. And most people think they know what their house is worth. They don't really know what their house is worth. But the real issue is they don't really think about the incidental costs when they sell a house and what's actually going to be left. And for me, I recommend that people, depending on your age, maybe not every year, but every so often, and obviously I do that. If you know another agent, they can do it, but don't just get a value of your house, get a net sheet that shows you what you would actually have in your possession after you sell the house. And another thing I would suggest is find out what the rental value of the property is, because there could be a situation where you have, let's just say you have one parent left. That parent has a medical issue that requires them to go into rehab for 3 months, and they don't have the cash and the insurance to cover the cost of that. Well, maybe you don't want to sell the house. Maybe they're going to go back into the house. Maybe you could rent the house out, get $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000. Who knows, what rentals might be by that time. But at the end of that person could either move back in, or you may end up inheriting the house later. But when you sell the house, you liquidate it, you get the cash. That can be a good thing. However, if the intention was for somebody to inherit that house, if that's what the parent wanted, well, that eliminates that goal. If you have a sudden need for money and you have to sell the house to get the money for care, that house is no longer being inherited. And houses are about more than just money. It's a family home. There could be a lot of reasons why you want to hold on to that. So I would say get the sale price and the net for what the house is going to sell for, what your proceeds actually will be, and then also get an estimate of what the house would rent for. And actually, I had a friend do this a few years ago. They weren't ready to sell the house. They just did not want to sell the house they grew up in. After their mom passed. Actually, I also had one where mom went into senior assisted living, and they just rented the house out and they used the money to offset the cost. And honestly, when they finally sold the house, it sold for a lot more than it would have if they'd sold it right away when they needed the money. So that's a really important thing to think about. And the other thing is, when you watch like this kind of video, I don't know if you'll be watching this on YouTube or if you're watching a Facebook post or whatever the case may be, people say, oh, healthcare is expensive, home care is expensive, getting old is expensive, all those things. How about calling somebody who handles those types of things and finding out, what does that cost right now in today's dollars, right? People plan their retirements. They figure out what their income is going to be. How about going the next step and having somebody tell you, if this happened to you right now, here's what it would cost? Because everything kind of goes up with inflation. Rather than having it be a vague, possible, maybe thing that you may have to deal with later, have an idea of what it is right now so that you can make the most accurate plan and have a better understanding of what may happen in the future. As you're having these conversations with a parent or loved one, we talk about motivation, why they're moving. I mean, sometimes it's just obvious, they can't go up and down steps anymore and they need a one-level living or whatever the case may be. And that's under motivation. When we talk about it, But there's something that I've learned that's really important when you're communicating with people, especially um, in a pressure situation like this, or when you're talking about end of life conversations, even if end of life is 20 years away, like those are fraught with emotion, and people's tendencies tend to show up. And I just want to give you something to think about when you're speaking to people about this, and how they may respond to it. So people tend to fall into two categories. There's people who go away from, and there are people who go toward. And an example of that is there are some people who want to buy a house in a specific school district because they want a good school. There are other people who want to buy a house in that same school district because they don't want to be in a bad school district. So people, almost everybody falls into those two categories. They're going towards something or they're going away from something. So and you should do this with everybody. It's a great tool to have to learn how best to communicate with people. But when you're speaking, when you're dealing with your family members, look out for those cues in what they talk about, because they will tell you which one they are. So if you have somebody who's resistant to a certain conversation about this, they say, I don't want to this, I don't want to that, I don't want this, I don't want to end up like that. They're an away from person. They're doing things or they're talking about things they want to avoid. So that's how they see the world. So when you're talking to them about what you think they should do, you should use avoiding things as your topic. So you could talk about what I don't want, or you don't want to end up with no money. You don't want to end up, whatever the case may be. Whereas some people are towards. They say, oh, I want to be in a place like this. I want to have a cafeteria. I want to have nursing. I want to have this. I want to be at the beach. I want to have a water view. I want to be in the mountains. When you're speaking to them, you want to speak to them in terms of what they can go toward. So if you're talking to a toward person and you use away from language, it just sounds like you're trying to induce fear. And if you use toward things to a fearful person, they feel like you're just missing all these bad things that could happen if they don't get what they want, or if they don't have the plan that they want. So those are really important things. And as you're talking to people, and you may already know which one of these your parent is, but it's a very strong driver of how people see the world. And if you want to have these conversations and have the best path to success, I would just suggest that you consider those two things before you present or talk about whatever conversation you're having at that point. And remember in your mind to use one of those two topics, or two methods of communication. The next two things we assess with our PATH acronym is the must-have and the may-have. And obviously, in this situation, it's kind of hard to talk about that. When you're looking for a house, you know what you want, you know what you'd like to have. Do you want a fireplace, not a fireplace? When you're having these conversations with someone to help them downsize or move or retire or move into assisted living, like there are so many variables in that come up that it's this video isn't really a way to cover all of those. I would just say, think about those. What are the things that you must have? And that could be near a certain doctor, near a hospital, near a certain sibling, near an airport, whatever the case may be. And then things that you may have that are things that are nice to have, but not necessarily deal breakers. It's just a way to break down the topics, and because there are a lot of topics in this process, to think about what you'd like to have, and what you must have and what you'd like to have. It's you have to draw the line somewhere with those things, because sometimes there's a great opportunity or place to live or whatever the case may be, but it doesn't have one of your must-haves, and you need to be able to eliminate that option from consideration quickly and decisively, so that you don't get caught up in considering too many options. And the next two parts of assessment are where and when. And again, the where and when, if we're being proactive and they're moving to a place, they're selling their family home and moving to a place they've wanted to retire to, obviously that where and that when is pretty much under their control, and you might not even really need to help with that, other than, of course, you should help them with the move if you can. it gets much more complicated, obviously, when there's only one person or there's a medical issue or any of those things that can come up, all the variations of having to sell a home or help someone sell a home. So the where and when again, that's one of those topics that's just so broad, and there are so many individual circumstances that it's kind of beyond the scope of this conversation to really help you decide that, other than to say it should be part of the initial thought process up front. Money, motivation, must have, may have, where, and when. Remember those things, and it'll help you lay out the plan for the future. The next part of the path process is take action. T is take action. And this one is, boy, there's a lot here. So, and let's just think about this. Selling a house under any circumstances is stressful and fraught with decisions and details and variables. There could be conflict and emotion and discussion and all of those things. An estate sale, when you're handling the sale of someone's house and they've passed already, you have all of those things, and then you layer on grief and emotion and family grief and emotion and a legal process. So think about that. Now, when you have a family member who's become ill or physically incapacitated or mentally incapacitated or both, you're basically layering that on top of all those other things I just mentioned, because there is grief and sadness with those situations, and realizing your mortality and all those things. I mean, it is a lot. It's a lot to deal with, and that's why so many times the sibling rivalries and all those things bubble up, because it's just such an emotional process. And that's why really we're making this video, because we want you to plan ahead so you'll have a path to get to where you need to go. So, and when you think about it, and as a person who might later be the one who's moving and having your children help you, one of the things you can do is decide what you're going to do with all your belongings, because boy, cleaning out that house is a landmine of emotions and competition and all sorts of things. Not to mention, if you have a lot of stuff, because we all like our treasures, it can be a logistical headache for your children. So if you're the one who might be moving, you might want to think about dealing with all of that stuff, asking people in advance who wants grandma's china or who wants the china hutch or whatever the case may be, because the last thing you want is people, after some dramatic situation, having to decide that in 10 minutes while they're standing in the living room trying to figure out what to do with everything. You can have that conversation in advance and say, who wants this, who wants that, here's where it'll go to, and then we'll deal with it. So that's one thing you can do in advance. So you have the contents of the house to deal with, you have the house itself to deal with, and then you have the living arrangement to deal with. So the selling the house process is really the same as selling any other house, obviously, except for the emotional part and the property that's contained within it. And then when you get to the, let's say you've done all the work, you've cleaned out the house, you've got everything done, and now you've got the house on the market, and then you have offers that come in. And you might have one sibling that wants one thing and one that wants another. And I would suggest strongly that if you don't have a really tight and agreeable arrangement with your siblings, that you pick one to be in charge and get it done, because otherwise, again, you can drive a wedge between family members just in the home sale process of a parent, for sure. I've seen it happen plenty of times. So you can have one person who's really, their role is to do all of that. And if the parent is still alive, obviously, you'll have to figure out where to put that money. And that's part of why I want to talk to an estate planner and bring an estate planner into this conversation, so we can talk about some of those things and help you make a great choice. One more topic I wanted to discuss about this and about the benefit of planning ahead is what I see a lot is you'll have a parent or family member who's physically incapacitated, but mentally they're still fine. And when you're trying to sell their house, That's a tough one because let's say they're in a rehab or something like that, or they're in assisted living, but they're sharp as a tack. And they're going to want to know everything that you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it. And quite honestly, a lot of the times they're going to want to resist a lot of what you're doing because it's just human nature. You don't want people taking your things and telling you what to do and taking away your autonomy. That happens pretty frequently where they can't go to the house and they can't direct things. And that actually makes them more fearful and more concerned about what's happening because they can't be there to see it. Very frustrating. When you have the plan in advance, you can eliminate some of that because you can remind them that that's what they agreed to and that's what you decided to do, and you're just carrying forward with their wishes. The other side of that coin is they're they have physical capacity, but not the mental capacity. And that's really a tough one because, everything is on a spectrum, and the mental acuity on the spectrum can really become an issue in these situations because clearly if somebody's completely mentally unable to make these decisions, then they can't make the decisions. The problem is someone has to. So if you've planned in advance and you have the right paperwork in place, then somebody's already been decided that if this happens, they will be in charge of things. If you haven't done that, you have to get guardianship of that person, which takes weeks, if not months, to do, because someone needs to be able to legally sign documents, and obviously if they can't, someone has to. And let me just tell you that layering that on top of all of this is really, really hard. And again, you might have other siblings who are competing for that role, all those things. It can be quite a handful. The other problem is you need to be careful who you're working with because, and I've been in this situation before where people are just on the edge of being able to sign things. And, I won't I won't let a parent sign something if I don't think they have the mental capacity to understand what's happening. And I've seen it done. I know people who have had this happen to them where clearly the siblings or the one child or whoever it was basically set the parent up to sign things. Like they didn't really understand what was going on. And that's just really not how it should be. And again, when they do that, sometimes there are other siblings or other family members or other things that they don't know about. There could be tax implications, tax liabilities, all these other things that could be that could come up because of this. And since you got things to happen because you were able to get somebody to let the parent sign when they really shouldn't have, that can just be a big issue. So that's definitely something to think about. Again, with this pre-planning, it can just save a lot of this drama and hurt that can happen in these situations. So to wrap this all up, I want to just remind everybody that it really is better to have a plan in advance. And none of this is easy. None of it is fun. It's a tough time. I mean, obviously, when you're helping them sell their house to retire and move to their beach house, that's okay. But as people get older, the situations become harder. The need for planning ahead becomes even stronger. And one of the things we're working on is an estimate spreadsheet that includes all of the costs of moving. One of the issues, everybody can figure out what their house is worth to a degree. And as I said earlier, I think you should do that periodically, have an actual assessment. But there's also, there's clean out costs. If there's junk, do you have to have junk hauling? Do you have to have the house cleaned afterwards? There are, moving expenses, all those things. Like you really need to have all of them detailed before you make these decisions because most people don't have so much money that they can just do whatever they want without considering the financial ramifications. So what you don't want to do is start yourself down a path where you can't afford the destination. And I've seen that happen before. I've seen people where they bought a house and they couldn't put blinds or shades up because they underestimated the cost of the move, and they had to do the sheets with the thumbtacks. like people do sometimes when they're buying their first house. So it's really important to have a clear financial picture. Obviously, we can help you with that. We can connect you with caregiver resources, all of those things, if you're at the point where you need them now. But I really want to urge everybody to have a plan, work through the plan, have great communication with your family members if you can, so you can have a really great outcome. And we wish you the best. And if you have any questions, let us know.